everyone for our first HerStory of the fall semester and of the academic year. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules today. For those of you who don't know me, there are a few new faces in the room. I am Trista Bergerud, the Vice Chair of the Women's Commission and Assistant Director in the Graduate School. So today I have the honor of introducing Dr. Lisa Perhamus for our first HerStory. So Lisa serves as the inaugural director of the Perhamus Center for Civil Discourse and is a professor in the Brooks College of Interdisciplinary Studies. Earning her PhD from the University of Rochester in Curriculum Studies, her master's in sociology from the New School for Social Research, and her Bachelor of Arts degree from William Smith College with a double major in English and Religious Studies. Lisa's interdisciplinary background continues to provide inspiration for her current civil discourse work. She grounds herself in the idea that every person has a right to be understood, and through her teaching, scholarship, and service, Lisa seeks ways to elevate people's stories in the face of societal barriers that often silence people. Originally from upstate New York, Lisa enjoys spending time with family and friends, working in her intergenerational garden, and going on backpacking adventures. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Perhamus.
Thank you everyone for being here, and I'm going to talk today a little bit about my intergenerational garden and my backpacking adventures. So thank you to the Women's Commission for this invitation, and it is an honor to share my story with all of you here today. So I want to thank you so much for coming. Going to get started by sharing that the photograph behind the title is the Rocky Mountains. This was my very first backpacking trip, and I did it with my sister, and just to clarify, I did not climb this mountain. I was rather in the woods going through a trail, and I finally got to this view and saw the mountain, and it was breathtaking. So I took a photograph. So I love backpacking. This is a picture of my backpack. This particular pack is 46 pounds. It's the lightest I've gotten my pack so far. My very first backpacking trip was 52 pounds when I went to the Rocky Mountains. And you'll see my trekking poles and my boots, and I have all kinds of equipment in my backpack. And I'm going to share with you today some of the tools that I pull out of my backpack to navigate myself on the trail, and that also help me navigate life. So I'm inviting you to join me for a hike. Let's go for an adventure. This summer, I went to the Adirondacks in New York. So if you're unfamiliar, I wanted to show everyone the Adirondacks Park is up here. It borders Canada and Vermont. It's in New York State. And the picture to the left is actually the trail that I hiked this past summer. And as you will note, it's very rocky, and I really needed my boots and I needed my poles because I was really afraid of twisting my ankle. I have twisted my ankle and been unable to walk while backpacking before. So it took me about 3 minutes to decide I couldn't do it. But I had traveled all that way, and I was determined. This was day number 1 of a week-long backpacking trip in a very remote wilderness area of the Adirondacks. When I called the forest ranger to say, what is the condition of the trail? And he said, gee, I have no clue. The beavers could have done damage, and a bridge could be out, it could be overgrown, the trail could be gone, but I'll go check it out for you. And he came back and he said, everything's great, but I want you to know, you will see no people. You will not be able to follow anyone's footsteps. It will be overgrown brush, and really remote. So for me, that sounded like the perfect vacation. So I was so excited. So I started hiking, and I kept going at many hours. I crossed a stream, I crossed a second stream, and all of a sudden, I couldn't see the trail. I looked behind me and I saw the trail marker on the tree and the path from where I had come, and I knew where I was. I looked in front of me after I crossed the stream. My waterproof boots did work. There were no footsteps. There was no opening for a path. There were no signs of a trail anywhere. So, I was really determined to do this hike, and so I said, I know there's got to be a trail here. If I just push through this brush, I'll find it. But it's very easy to lose your way on the trail, and just taking a few steps off the trail can make you get disoriented. Anyone who knows me knows that I have no sense of direction. I carry a compass, first thing I pull out of my backpack, but I'll also tell you, I only sort of know how to use it. So it wasn't overly helpful. So I kept trying to decide, go forward, or what was my other choice? Turn back, which was so disappointing. But turn back is what I did, because I had to be safe and secure and use my my smarts. Like, nature is more powerful than people, and sometimes we have to just sort of accept what the conditions are and keep on trucking. And that is one of the lessons that I learned, is that sometimes you can't have things go the way you want. You have to accept the conditions and keep on moving. Ironically, I had just read an article before coming on this hike that said, the title of it was, When to Bail on the Trail. And I was like, okay, I guess this qualifies. So, on the trail, there are tough choices like that. And this quote is foundational to who I am. We each have mountains before us that at different times in our lives serve like blocks or limitations or barriers, obstacles, things that we have to overcome. We each have different things we carry. I carry my backpack, but you all have different things that you carry. We somehow always all carry the things that give us inner strength to meet those obstacles and that help us navigate when we might be lost on the trail or your path towards your leadership or your journey with your children or whatever your path is at that moment. So for me, if there is a mountain before you, I have to be a backpacker. I have to, in my head, say, I can navigate this, and I have the tools to do so. I want to leave you with that. So I want to go back in time a little bit. Before I showed you the Rocky Mountains, the Adirondacks, this is Isle Royale, which is an island north of Michigan. This was my very first solo backpacking trip. And I was super excited, and little did I know, super unprepared. My pack was 56 pounds. This is also the first day of my hike, and I got to this bridge. And even though it's not very high, for someone like me who is really afraid of heights, it was super high. And I thought, all I have to do is turn my body a little bit, just like the gymnasts on balance beams, and the weight of my pack is going to throw me in the water. And all I could think was everything I was carrying was going to be soaked and ruined for the week. So I decided, yeah, I can't do that. I just can't cross. I was terrified. So I did what any wise person would do. I sat down and decided, I'll wait for the next backpacker to come and ask for assistance. That seemed like a really great plan. After a few minutes, when no one came, and I realized that was not really very self-reliant on my solo backpacking trip, I decided, well, I guess you're going to have to turn back, because I was too scared to cross. But I drew from the quote, there was a mountain before me, and I had to be a backpacker. This is my first trip when I realized I really needed trekking poles. I hadn't gotten my trekking poles yet. I was hiking without them. So in my mind, so that I wouldn't fall, and I was walking on this little, it's maybe 8 inches wide, and my boots are really big, and I felt like I couldn't keep my balance. And I'm walking along, I picked up a twig, no bigger than a pen, really. And I pretended in my head this was a long pole that would help me keep my balance. So I kid you not, I clutched this twig like this, sweat's pouring off my hands, right? And I'm going across like this. I got to the other side, and I literally collapsed. I fell to the ground. That was the first time I understood the phrase that when you're nervous, your knees buckle. I had been so scared that I had been trembling and sweaty, and I just fell to the ground. But you must do the one thing you think you cannot do. And I had done it. So my lesson for that was that I was capable, that I could, in fact, do it. I want to say that even though I live by this quote, that you must do this one thing you think you cannot do, it doesn't come without qualifications. I used to believe that wholeheartedly and face anything that was scary that came my way. But I also grew up in a family that was complicated. We all have complicated families, right? With a lot of tension and some dysfunction. And it's not always wise to do the thing you think you cannot do if it's a thing that puts you in danger or makes you unsafe. Sometimes, just like when I got lost on the trail, you have to accept your conditions and disengage. But let's go back in time a little bit to the family where I was just talking about. This is 5 and 20, routes 5 and 20 in New York State. I'm from upstate New York. I've lived in different places along 5 and 20 between Albany and Buffalo. And, excuse me, I have family dotted all along. I do not have a home that I call my roots, a place that I go back to. But I call 5 and 20 my home. This road is my home. My family is all along here. I find it to be an honest road. As a child, whenever we would drive along, I would see people working the land, fixing their cars in the driveways, people just doing the everyday, just making it and getting by. I lost my train of thought. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say was this road has special significance to me because when my parents got divorced, we traveled this road a lot. So this was also my path back and forth between my parents. So before the divorce, I lived here in Cheshire, New York, in a little village where my mom baked the bread for the little village store and would give me candies to go buy penny candy at the store. I had a bedroom at various times in each one of these rooms, and this is the bay window, and I just have to tell you that my mom would put on music and we would dance. And we would dance to John Denver, I didn't choose the music, Fats Domino, Creedence Clearwater Revival, and a whole bunch of a hodgepodge of music. But it was the best time, dancing. Those are happy memories. It's also true, as I alluded to, that there were tough times in our family. In the years leading up to the divorce, it was rather tumultuous. So the way in which I navigated, because I've been navigating my whole life, just like I navigate on the trail. This is my rocking horse, and I used to sit on this rocking horse for hours and hours listening to stories on records. And I would travel to faraway places and meet new people with my imagination. because it took me away from where I was. So it was a really important tool for me. And to this day, I sit in my rocking chair. Not my rocking horse, I don't fit anymore. I've graduated to a chair. This here we all just called the rock. When I was little, this rock was huge. It was a boulder. I went back as an adult and it apparently shrunk because it's much smaller now. But I share this with you because this rock was one place that I grounded myself. The sun would hit it and I would sit on the rock and it would be warm and soothe me. My friends and I would have picnics on the rock. Once I ran away from home and I went to the rock with my suitcase. I have no clue what my plan was. In fact, I knocked on my parents' bedroom door and I said, "How do you spell hour?" And they said, "Hour, like it's hours, or hour like in time?" I said, "Hour like in time," because I was writing my runaway note and it said, "Dear Mom and Dad, I am running away for 1 hour." And I packed my bags and I went to the rock. I'd like to pause a moment and just take note of the majesty of this tree. This is a box elder tree. It's my grandparents' tree in another small town in Leroy, New York. And as a child, I climbed that tree, sat in that tree, read sitting in that tree. I grew up into adulthood still climbing the tree. I had children. They climbed the tree. Everyone in my family climbs and sits in this tree. It is a grounding place. I often get the question, "Don't you get scared when you go backpacking by yourself?" And I say, not at all, because there are trees and rocks and things that soothe me and keep me safe, that ground me so I know where I am. My grandparents' place was one constant in my life and a very important relationship for me. So all of these adventures that I've shared with you bring me to this place of believing in these principles of emergent strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown. And I'd like to share some of them with you because they guide not only me in my living, but they also guide my work doing civil discourse. Small is good. Small is all. The large is a reflection of the small. I should interrupt myself to say, Adrienne Maree Brown in this book argues that there is no problem that society faces, no social problem that nature hasn't already figured out a way to solve. And so for social justice work, we need to look to nature. Change is constant. Be like water. There is always enough time for the right work. There is a conversation in the room that only these people at this moment can have. Find it. I would stop right here and say, if you were to look around this room at each other and recall the bridge that I was talking about needing to cross, and ask yourself, what bridge might I need to cross to go have a conversation with that person who I don't know, or whose ideas are opposite of mine, or whatever that might be. Never a failure, always a lesson. Trust the people. If you trust the people, they become trustworthy. And move at the speed of trust. Focus on critical connections more than critical mass. Build the resilience by building the relationships. In my civil discourse work, this is foundational because everything about dialogue is built on how we come to know each other in relationship. Less prep, more presence. That's a hard one for me to remember in higher ed, right? But so important. And finally, what you pay attention to grows. I think of this last one a lot, what you pay attention to grows, because I think that just like when I was crossing the bridge, I didn't mention that I have really not great vision. Like I can't block out the periphery vision, like what's on the side. So when I was crossing the bridge, I could see all of it. I couldn't just focus on the wood. So, and I was clutching the twig, but as best as I could, I also sort of went like that, right? So that I could focus on it. And I've also learned, and that focus became greater than the fear in the moment of letting me cross. But I've also learned with my own children that when they share things with me, I need to pay attention so that it can grow. So the key lesson that I find in these stories is that we all have inner strength. I carry a backpack. I'm not sure what you carry, but you carry your own stories. I'm from 5 and 20. I'm not sure where you're from, but I know you're from somewhere, and you carry that with you. This all comes into how we dialogue with one another and plays a really big role in how I do my civil discourse work, right? Because we have to be able to be comfortable and cognizant of our own personal roots to understand why we think what we think so that we can more authentically engage with the other person we're in conversation with. The next story I want to share with you is my undergraduate experience at William Smith College. And I sort of smile when I say that because technically it's Hobart and William Smith colleges. It is a coordinate college system. Hobart is the men's college. William Smith is the women's college. Some students go through the whole college experience saying, I go to Hobart, William Smith. And some people say, oh no, I go to Hobart. Oh no, I go to William Smith. I was a student that came in saying, I go to Hobart, William Smith. I graduated and everyone said, you're such a Smithy. I was a William Smith person. And so I want to share with you a little bit about my journey that made all of that sort of possible. The very first day at the welcoming assembly, there were 2 messages that I share with students every academic term. Say hi to the people you pass by, because that's how we build community. And challenge your assumptions. Challenging my assumptions is exactly what William Smith did for me. So in my first term, I wrote a paper. It was a draft for Professor Mary Gerhardt. Turned out to be one of my favorite professors, but I didn't know it at the time because she read my paper and promptly gave it back and said, oh no, you can't write this. I had written all about mankind, and she said, you've written yourself out of the story, Lisa. This is humankind. This is not how I grew up. It's not what I believed. It's not what I wanted to say. And I was a little rebellious. And I was like, my paper, my words, my voice. And so I wrote mankind and turned in my paper. I promptly received a D. So Mary Gerhardt I studied with over time and did come to understand who I was as a woman and did come to understand not to write myself out of the story that I was sharing. I also met during this time Bell Hooks. Some of you are familiar with Bell Hooks, who is a scholar. And it was a life-changing experience for me. She came and she visited my class, and it was the first time, and this is embarrassing to say, but I will share. I don't know how, I was 19, I guess, at the time. And it was the first time I realized my whiteness, and that somebody challenged me to understand what my whiteness had afforded me in going through my life. So it was a very profound experience as I started thinking through relationships and systems of power in ways that I had never done before. Fast forward a little bit, and I also studied with someone who is my mentor and became a close friend, even came and officiated at my wedding. I'm very influenced by these two books, Michel Foucault, The History of Human Sexuality, which helped me understand how systems of power work and that people are wounded by systems of power. But it took me reading Toni Morrison, who, by the way, is my favorite author, reading Song of Solomon, which, by the way, is my favorite book, to understand the human story of the consequences of systems of power, to understand the testimonial about what that was like. So I would say that I started undergoing like a very big change in how I thought, how I related to other people. And then I read this book. Bell Hooks I had met. After meeting her, I read this book. And it was another life-changing book. And I was giving a public talk. And the talk was called Coming to Voice. And I had studied relationships between Black and Jewish communities in the United States. And I had added all of that information with my meeting bell hooks and all of these other things, Foucault, that had made me start thinking about the ways power differences impact people. And I realized that I had subscribed to many of these ideas myself and how I grew up. I realized that I carried a lot of implicit bias, and I realized that I had most likely inadvertently probably hurt someone in the course of my lifetime. So I stopped speaking. This is a story I have not shared in Michigan. Only people in New York know this story, so deep breath. I stopped speaking for a spell because I was afraid of the power of my voice to hurt and wound. And I decided it was better to be safe and be quiet. When I read this book, I mean, just look at the title, Talking Back, right? So it gave me the courage to come to voice. And Bell Hooks talks about being publicly private, which is what I'm doing with you here right now. And why do we share our stories with each other? I know in civil discourse work we share our stories because it humanizes the conversation. We share our stories because it's how we can understand where each person is coming from. We share our stories because it's really hard to hate someone whose story you know. And so I realized that I had to also be publicly private, because it's in our sharing of stories that we learn we don't live in isolation, and that the experiences we've had, the trauma we've lived through, the grit we have, all of those kinds of things are somehow connected to other people's stories, and so that it creates a collective. And when you have a collective, you have power to create change. So this gave me hope. So I came to voice, and I gave a paper and started talking again. This was my key lesson. I use this image when I teach. So forgive me for sharing something that I use in class. But I use it because this is a rose growing, well, it's not a rose, but flowers growing in concrete. Jeffrey Duncan Andrade talks about this phenomena, and he calls it metaphoric of something called critical hope. Critical hope is having hope. When you look around, you see the reality, so it's not like you're hoping like, oh, I just think it's going to be grand. I just think it's going to be good, and it's just fluffy. But you're looking around and you're getting a good sense of, wow, this is really tough. You look around and you still have hope, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that the situation is hopeless. That's critical hope. And so I used to work a lot with soon-to-be teachers, and we would talk about the importance of understanding our students to be able to blossom and thrive in these ways. Because despite the conditions, the toxins that are in the environment, the concreteness, the lack of nourishment, there is a crack where the light can come through and the nourishment can come through and something can thrive and grow. In my backpack, I carry a water filter because you can't just drink out of the stream, right? You can get very sick. So it's the kind you have to pump. So I have to work really hard to get at my water, but you have to get out all of the bacteria and things like that. And so I think about that, and I think about this picture in the sense that we all have water filters of some sort, where we filter out the information and the new experiences we have through the lens of our upbringing. We filter out all of the toxins from our upbringing or our life experience that maybe were not helpful to us or positive influences, so that we're left with just the drinkable water. This is Detroit. These are students who took the very first civil discourse class. And we're working in one of the over 1,600 urban gardens in Detroit. And I share this with you because one of the reasons I developed this course is because when I moved here, I heard a lot of students talking about Detroit in stereotypical ways. And I said, let's go to Detroit and learn from the experts who live there, instead of having students be the experts who go to Detroit. So we went and we harvested food, and we met people whose communities were thriving. So unlike the stereotypes that call Detroit like concrete, I found flowers growing. They harvest food, they grow their own food, and one of their things is being independent of corporate food systems, so it's an alternative. Welcome to my garden. This is an intergenerational garden. These flowers came from my grandmother, who came from England. I forgot what I wanted to say about my garden. It's an intergenerational space where each plant sort of has a memory. And I think about my garden is where I go besides the trail when I need to ground myself. And as an intergenerational garden, it's also a place where I reflect on the cycle of life and death. So these images on the left is one of my tomato plants, as you can see, is just sprouting, coming to bloom. And on the right is Yankee Springs Trail, a trail, and you can see just sort of a speck of a dog. That's Bailey, my dog. She's since died, but we were going for walks. This image I share with you to represent birth, because something is just blossoming. The birth of my children is by far the most profound experience of my life. So I can't come to HerStory and not say that, right? On the right is an image that to me represents death. Because about 7 years ago, my younger brother was 35 and he died unexpectedly. And it was a challenge. I really needed my backpack. And I really needed the trail. And so I hit the trail with my dog Bailey, and I hiked a lot. His name was Bobby. He loved to hike, camp, fish, hunt, anything that took him outdoors. And so part of my story that I share with you today is that when I go hiking, I am not alone, even if there are no other footsteps, because I know my brother is there. After my brother died, some time passed, my grandchildren were born. This is what I'm talking about, the cycle of life and death. I'm currently watching my mother age. I am really cognizant of my own aging process and my own mortality. I don't know about you all, but I can't remember anything these days. It's terrible. But something that I don't share too much with folks, but I'll share here because it's an important part of my story, is that I'm very active with an organization called Compassion and Choices. It's a national organization, and I'm active with the Michigan chapter. And Compassion and Choices is all about making sure, giving resources and making sure people have access to chart one's own end-of-life journey. In my lifetime, I've lost a lot of people. I shared with you my brother. I leave out others. But I have seen too many times people not being able to have a say in their final days. You know, they're hooked up to machines, or they're not at home where they want to be, or the people who they love can't get there quite in time. Like, it's just never quite right. So Compassion and Choices is really about working with people proactively so that you can create the conditions to have access to chart your own end-of-life journey. So oddly enough, I care a lot about equity, access, and inclusion in the present time, in my life, in living. But I care about all of those same things as I face the prospect of my own mortality. And I think that that's really important. Yeah, I think we need each other. We can go from that to this. Okay, because another thing is true is that after my husband left, I became a single mom. And I was devastated. And I was convinced, just like when I was on the bridge or getting lost on the trail, that I was in a situation that I could not do. But people, relationships, friendships saw me through. And I call the people that I came to know and raise my children with my kinship family. And so I share a little bit of my kinship family with you because, like many of us, we form our own kind of family in adulthood with our friends and other folks. Okay, so Nada is on the guitar. Bridget, I guess we're all on the guitar. Bridget and me. This is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. Lots of fun. And then we were also at the Johnny Cash Museum. And I didn't label this picture because it detracted from the power of the image, but that's the African American Music Museum. Music has played a very big role in my life. I turn to music like I turn to the trail. And if I could teach any class, somebody asked me this when I first came to Brooks, if you could teach any class, what would it be? And I panicked and I gave a lousy answer. So I want, for the record, to say, I've decided now. I would love to teach a class on the music of social movements. Wouldn't that be cool? Yeah. Okay. So, this is my friend Melissa. She is my sister in my kinship family. And she, this is not making tamales here, but she and I started a tradition of making tamales every New Year's Eve. And with family, we would all gather and make tamales. Anyone who's made tamales knows it's very labor intensive. It takes many hours. So we would make tamales, and then when the clock struck midnight, we would celebrate by eating our tamales. And so even though there may not be a lot of family traditions from my own family that I carry forward, I think it's really important to realize we all can chart our own path forward and create our new traditions. I would say that the people I've introduced you to in my kinship family the tool that is in my backpack, where it's not really a tool, but it's just the plain water that I carry. Because after I filter out the water from the toxins of some of my upbringing, and I'm left with the water that's drinkable, think about it. Water's in our rivers, our oceans, our lakes, our streams. It connects us. It's sacred. It sustains us. We can't live without water. So in my backpack, when I carry the water, I'm carrying my friends with me. I want to leave you with a poem by Alice Walker. The nature of this flower is to bloom, rebellious, living against the elemental crush, a song of color, blooming for deserving eyes, blooming gloriously for itself. So what this poem means to me is like everything I've shared with you, and you all have all of your own story too, so maybe there's something that you can relate to in your own sort of way. I sort of feel like I stand here before you today doing work that I get to do that I love. I love civil discourse work, and that's a gift. And I'm grateful for it. I never forget where I came from. It gives me strength. It gives me sort of works like a rudder to help guide me through my life. But I'm also really cognizant that there were some tough times that I went through. And so I like that against the elemental crush. And how many of you live against some kind of elemental crush? And how do we each carry with us the essentials that we need? I carry my compass. I carry my water filter. I use my trekking poles. I have boots that ground me. My poles balance me. The water nourishes me. The food sustains me. It's the bare essentials of what I need, but it's everything that I need. We all carry some kind of something that is our inner strength, so that I hope that you can also be rebellious and living and blooming gloriously for yourself. So I want to thank you as I wrap up. And I am going to look at my notes because I think I'm going to forget if I don't. I want to thank you for listening to my stories of finding my way on the trail where I got lost and needed my compass, or when I was talking about being at William Smith when I realized I am capable. And by the way, a little interruption to myself because I forgot to mention it earlier. Is it okay? So Julia also went to William Smith, and I was her RA, so how cool is that? We lived in the Blackwell house, which was, of course, the best house. And civil discourse is non-competitive. I shared a story of building my resilience when I shared with you my intergenerational garden and cultivating my kinship family, where I carry my water for sustenance and community. So I invite us to reflect on all the tools that we carry so that we can all bloom. And I want to thank you for receiving my story today because, well, I was thinking driving here, I'm not sure anyone's ever asked me my story before. And so thank you. It's important we share our stories. Thank you. And I forgot that I had wanted to end with, and this is how it all relates to civil discourse, so we can do that during Q&A.
Yes, I was going to open it back up to you for Q&A. Tina has generously agreed to answering questions, so feel free to open it up. And we don't have a microphone, so you might just want to stand up and speak a little bit louder. Hi, Jack.
Hello, hello. Thank you for sharing. You talked about your experience as a solo biker. I wanted to know, is it something you enjoy just doing on your own, or have you, ask friends to join you, invite friends on that journey? And if so, can you talk a little bit about, how this went and the emotions and
Yes.
whatever you can share on that?
So I want to be really thoughtful when I answer this question because my son is here and has backpacked with me. So, which was fantastic. So yes, I have backpacked with other people. To me, it's not the same as solo backpacking at all. Backpacking, I didn't even get a chance to say what it was. Okay, now I lost my train of thought. Somebody tell me where I was. So solo backpacking to me is like a walking meditation. And to be honest, the thing I think about most on the trail are my children. And I think about parenting decisions I need to make, because anyone who thinks you don't parent your 20-somethings is not right. You still do. So I'm always making decisions. And so when I was backpacking with my sister in the Rocky Mountains or Gregory in Porcupine Mountains, I wasn't having those kinds of meditations. I was instead, I hope this is okay to share, I was instead feeling when I hiked with my son that I was in part leaving my legacy, because I am not a rich woman. I will not be leaving, sorry Gregory, will not be leaving lots of assets, but I leave him with the tools to be a backpacker when there's a mountain before him. So I enjoy hiking with other people, but it is very different than the solo backpacking. Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
You talked about, I can't remember the author, but you had an author with her quotes, and you said it leads sort of how you think about civil discourse and the work that you do. Can you talk about the prep versus presence and more about how you think about that? Because you stopped on that one, and it seems very meaningful. Can you talk more?
It's hard for me because I think we're socialized to prep all the time. I feel that pressure in my teaching and when I'm serving on a committee and all of that, like we're always sort of prepping. But I think that when we do that, we sort of lose a little bit of being fully present with one another. And in civil discourse work, what I have found is many businesses will call and say, we need a training on civil discourse. Everything is really challenging in our workplace right now. Can you come in? We've got an hour. Do you have some bullet points? This is the time we can get everyone together. And I smile and I'm gracious, or at least I try to be, but that to me is like the mindset of prep, when civil discourse is really about presence. It's slow, it takes time, you have to build relationships, you have to move at the speed of trust, all of those things that I sort of shared. And while we're talking about the connection to civil discourse, I want to say that something I forgot to mention before is that I carry that image of the bridge with me in almost every workshop that I do, and I offer all of you the bridge today during the presidential election season, right? Because our country is so divided, and think about all the ways in which we need to bridge. Yeah, thank you. Melissa.
So, thank you, Lisa. As I think probably everyone in the room, I would imagine most people in the room know you, know of you. I just want to say thank you as a friend and colleague for sharing your story that was just so perfectly you. So thank you for that, and thanks for allowing all of us to be here. I was really curious. I never knew about this time when you stopped speaking. That's a big deal. So I'm just curious to hear you talk a little bit more about what was going on and why, how you chose that, what was that like, how long did that happen, what were the people around you thinking, saying, doing? Just, I'm curious about that experience.
Yeah, so it was a few months, and that's the degree to which I was afraid of hurting someone. And I find that this is a story that many of my students can relate to as they start recognizing their own positions in this world, that if you ask sometimes a question about racism and the room just goes quiet, right? And I say, what is the quiet about? And invariably somebody says, I don't want to hurt someone. I don't want to say anything because I don't want to hurt someone. But when we do that, we're not having conversation. We're not in community. We're depriving ourselves of the chance to build community and a collective that can work towards whatever it is we want to work towards, right? And so it took me reading those books and meeting the people that I did to realize that I had a responsibility, like Audre Lorde says, to use my voice. That was a responsibility. And so I do it awkwardly to this day. Anyone who sees me do public speaking knows that I mess up. Like right now I'm thinking, I totally forgot to tell a story about Sparrowbush and Shaker High School. You know, like I forget things when I'm nervous, you know, but I'm always trying. Because I think in the trying we show our authentic self, and that's when we can connect with one another in conversation. I don't know if that answers it, but. Yes, Noreen?
So what's the story about Shaker High School?
The bridge also represents how I feel I have always lived between spaces in my life. And I grew up under the poverty level, and I lived in Section 8 housing with HUD assistance. And I would go in an apartment, and I would go from that reality, travel the school bus, that's like traveling the bridge, to my high school, which was a very affluent high school. And I never felt like I fit in. I never felt like I had the right clothes. I was embarrassed to have anyone come to my home. In fact, one time I was getting a ride home from a friend, and I knew they came from a lot of money, and I so much didn't want them to know where I lived that I told them I lived in this house. And they dropped me off, and I even was bold enough to walk into the back of the house because they wouldn't leave until I had walked in, hoping that the owners wouldn't come out and say, what are you doing, stalking my property? And then I walked home in the dark. I also used to have, it used to be in the old days if you had, I shouldn't say that in the old days, just last week, neon colored lunch cards for students who had free lunches. Now they don't do that. But what that meant was I would stand in the cafeteria line and turn over my free lunch card, you know, neon orange. And one day I saw the person behind me, one of the popular girls who I knew came from, or I assumed came from money. And she was watching that, and I so embarrassed that I swore I would never use it again, and I didn't. I also didn't tell my mother because I knew she would pack me food and we didn't have enough. So I stopped eating lunch. So for me, and then, you know, so I would go back and forth between Sparrowbush and my high school, back and forth. And I still feel like I live between worlds. There's always that 5 and 20 know-how, common sense part of me while I get dressed up and come give a talk at a university, right? I'm always a little bit of both. Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about your favorite plants in your intergenerational garden?
Well, this is embarrassing, but I actually don't know the names of a lot of my plants. Just like the purple flowers for my grandma, I call them the purple flowers for my grandma. But lilies are actually my favorite flower. This is from my garden. I don't know how to answer that in terms of plants, but I can tell you in my intergenerational garden, I have not only plants from my grandmother, my grandfather, plants, believe it or not, I don't want to gross anyone out, but I did home births with my daughter, tried to do a home birth with my son. It didn't work out, but we used the midwife in the hospital. But what I did was save the placenta, which my mother mistook as steak once from the freezer. I saved it for a year, And then on my daughter's first birthday, I planted a rose bush under it. So I guess I'm backing up to say each thing in my garden has a story like that to it, as well as the sticks and different things that I plant there. They come from times with friends and other places like that. Yes, why I'm vegetarian. My son is always a jokester. Yes, Jack?
I have one question, not to get too, political or anything. This election feels different. It feels different in terms of women's rights. It feels different in terms of the sort of arc of women's history in this country. Is there anything from your backpack, any lesson, anything you like to share with women here in the context of what we are facing, of what we are faced with this election cycle?
That's a good question. Maybe my fuel that I carry that cooks my food and my stove, because the fuel is the energy that keeps us going. It can spark passions and ideas and spread them and bring them to light and insights. I also think that women in community need to fuel each other, because one of the things that happens is we're socialized to be each on our own isolated little island, just like the importance of telling stories to realize we're not. So I think during this presidential election, one of the challenges is to build community, to work towards the change that is important to you without it falling into the way people are polarized, right? We don't want to build community over here and then build community over here. Oops, but then there's a community over here. This is what we have, is a lot of division, right? So I would want to build community and a collective that's more inclusive than that. One of the things that scares me about this election is the level of our toxic polarization. And I do this work because I believe in the power of dialogue to heal. And I believe it offers us a path forward. I don't know. So fuel? Yes?
I'd love to hear more about the Detroit trip, the garden project. I've lived there. That's my neck of the woods. And I participated in several gardens in Detroit for an agriculture network. I'm not sure that exists anymore, but I'd love to hear about what that was, and was it students from here?
Yep, so it was students from here, and we took 2 trips to Detroit. We spent a lot of time at the Boggs Center. I don't know if you're familiar with the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center for Nurturing Community Leadership, just as long as higher ed names for some reason. But we would go and work, that was on Manistee Street in a garden called Feed 'em Freedom Growers. And we would, anything, Mama Myrtle was in charge, and anything Mama Myrtle needed, we did, whether that was the garlic, planting the potatoes, putting things away for the season, or whatever. But one of the favorite parts for students, they were all students from Grand Valley. The very first trip we took, I'll stop for just a moment to say, we took the university van, and we were driving to Detroit, and one of my students said, who was from the UP, and he said, I told my parents I was going to Detroit today, and they asked me if I was bringing my gun. And I said, that is precisely why we're going to Detroit today. And I took him to a garden, and he said, my parents would be so surprised that we worked in the garden and I didn't need my gun. But one of the favorite parts for students was after we worked in the garden, we would light a bonfire and sit around the bonfire. And Myrtle and her husband, Wayne, who was a Black Panther Party member, would tell stories about the ways from their perspective, you could sort of revolutionize our society by the way we grow and eat our food. And that if we do it as an alternative to the corporate ways of stripping the land. And what would it mean for us to be in community with the land and work the land and eat the food from it? And for many students, thinking about capitalism in a critical way was new, but it was tangible because they were also sitting there eating the pepper, right, that they could understand. So yeah, I can talk to you more after class too. This isn't class, but habit.
I appreciate the poem you have projected on the screen, and I'm struck by the middle 3 lines. A song of color blooming for deserving eyes. How would you describe deserving eyes?
This is Greg Warson. He never asked me a tough question. Well, I'll say in my own terms, deserving eyes are people who I respect. I think that we all know people in our lives whose advice and comments we're better off sort of letting roll off our back so we can keep on going. But those deserving eyes are the people who have given pieces of themselves to you. They've trusted you in some way. They've cared enough to be honest and keep it real. I find that to be rare and a treasure and a gift, and that would be how I think of deserving eyes, I think. This isn't hard at all to tell your story and like trauma, divorce, poverty. But we were playing the electric guitars too. I want to thank everyone again, and again, thank you for receiving my story.
Thank you so much all for taking time out of your busy day and for sharing your beautiful, inspiring story. One more round. I want to do just a quick little plug for our upcoming Women's Commission events. We have our second community read discussion next week. This is our second one. I think we're reading the next, 3 or 4 chapters? We're only 3 chapters in, so if you haven't read the first 3, please feel free to join. We have an in-person and a Zoom option, if that works better for you. And then on November 6th, we have a post-election self-care drop-in event that will be open, I think, for 4 or so hours, and you can stop in, and there will be all the things to help you in whatever ways needed after the post-election day. So thank you all for coming.